one of the cool things, or one of the things I'm most curious about is as you were going through these different roles and learning how to be a marketer, how did that sort of change your sense of identity? Did it change it? Because, I really like this idea of being a human in the marketing world and really experiencing or practicing empathy. And it's kind of hard, depending on where you end up in the marketing world, to be able to hold on to that sense of empathy and that sense of identity, because a lot of times you're so driven by metrics, or you're so driven by certain outside forces, or just even the cynicism that can sometimes come with it. So I'm curious how, being freelance or being full-time, how did these roles help shape your identity, and when did you start really getting an eye for empathy?
Trying to think here. When I started it, so identity is such an interesting thing because while I believe that maybe I bring my full self to work, my identity is not defined by my job, which is really, it's a very nuanced difference, but it is different. I can be my full person with all of my characteristics and all of my attributes at work. But when I leave work, I'm not, so obsessed about what's happening at work or what's happening on LinkedIn, or I'm really good about just like, this is not my job. I'm not going to be solely driven by this in my life. And I think that also that might be a generational, like my parents, both of them, um, my dad was a stockbroker for 30 years, same broker, like same everything. He worked for himself technically, but my mom has been at Abbott for 30 years. And so they both have been at these companies working in the same job, same role, like you said, for 30 years. And I just don't want that for my life. It seems more so that that's just like what they do. They go to work and they come home, and it's a different turn off. Like how my mom turns off of work is so different than how I turn off of work. But I can see now she's still working because that is her identity now. And she's like, what would I do without this? And I think that I'm like, I'm looking at my mom and I'm like, that's crazy. If I was you, I'd be traveling the world and going and doing all of these other things that I'd like to fill my time with. And I think that it definitely does get shaped over time because for so long, she was even a mom was a really big part of her identity when we were growing up. You know what I mean? And it still is now, but we can kind of take care of ourselves. So I think there was in that 5 years of my career, there was a lot of personal changes. That's such a growth stage from 22 to 27. You are a completely different person from 22 to 27.
Yeah.
And I don't know that a lot of people will be like, okay, I don't know about that, but I am. I, at 22, I've been in just so many different friendships have come in and out of my life, different relationships, different jobs. And I choose to see that as me not moving job to job. It's me growing as a person. And then maybe what I want in my job is just not what the new person wants in a job. Does that make sense?
I think it definitely does. And there's this concept that I hear all the time, or I've heard in the past, where folks talk about how hard it is to make friends as you get older, and especially after you get out of college. They're like, oh, once you're out of college, it's so hard to make friends. And I think part of that is like, well, how are you experiencing the world? Are you staying at one job? Are you moving around? Are you getting involved in organizations? Are you volunteering? What other things are you doing to bring people into your life? And sometimes people are like, well, the only people that I really know are my coworkers and my spouse. Like that's my entire world. And I don't really like my coworkers. It's like, oh my goodness. Right. And so, you'll find people in these positions. And I think it's interesting to see that generational difference, because I think there are massive differences in priorities, and part of that can just be age, part of that could be generational. Maybe, as we get closer to our 50s and 60s, we'll look back on this podcast and
Really?
laugh at ourselves, right? But there's definitely differences in how, if you want to be someone who stays at a company for 20 years, a layoff is an incredibly terrifying, detrimental thing.
Yeah.
But if you're someone who's constantly moving or looking for new opportunities, or let's just say building a life that is more resilient, and there's a great book called Anti-Fragile. Like, how do you build a life that is anti-fragile, where one thing breaking doesn't make the whole house of cards fall down. And that's really, in my mind, the biggest difference between a lifer and a job hopper, right? A job hopper is less fragile than a lifer in a lot of ways. Whereas a lifer might be more financially stable or have more savings or something than a hopper. But what are your views on that generational difference and maybe like the impact of a layoff on someone who is younger and earlier and more adept to change and someone who's later on in their career?
I think it's super interesting because if I thought about this, so I was, if I was laid off a year before I was, and I maybe 2 years, like if I was at a different company and I don't know that I would have been able to handle it as well as I did. Well, in air quotes.
Yeah.
Um, but now I just feel like I have, by this age or in this life stage, whatever you want to call it, I feel a little bit more grounded in who I am as a person. And I think that that makes all of the difference for when you get laid off. And I don't know that that's even tied to an age or tied to a, like, I don't know. For me, it was just, I finally feel like I know decently who I am. And maybe that happens at 40 for some, or maybe earlier for some people. I have no idea. I just know how it was for me. I think it would absolutely be harder to be laid off from somewhere that you spend a significant amount of your time, because I think the more and more that you spend, it was really hard for me to leave my first job because I spent 3 years of my life there and it was all that I knew in my career.
Same.
So, and you do get more attached, obviously, and as you spend more time there. And I think you get a little bit more jaded if they let you go and you're like, why? I gave you so much of my time and I invested so much. I come here every day, day in and day out, and you're like not seeing that value. Um,
I love that you called that out really quick. I gave you so much of my time. I think that
mhm.
that is a very interesting phrase that we use when things change, whether it's a job or a relationship or whatever the thing might be. It's like you'll see the cliche in a movie, I gave you the best years of my life, right? And it's such an interesting perspective because it it forgets the fact that you're getting a ton of stuff from those years
Yep.
and learning, or at least should be learning something about yourself during that time. And if you leave a relationship after 5 years and you're not a different person, there was definitely not enough growth happening in that relationship, right? And I think that there's some really interesting maybe psychology to dig into with that sort of, this company owes me something.
Mhm.
And I think your mindset is quite different than maybe some of these other ones, some of these more long-term mindsets where it almost feels like, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, so let me know what your thoughts are, but like, no companies owe you anything. You're going to be just fine figuring out your own thing.